for loops. If we remember, loops contain code that we want to do either a certain number of times or while a certain condition is true or false. A for loop we use when we want to have a loop iterate a certain number of times. Remember, each pass through a loop is called an iteration. In a for loop, let's look at the syntax for that. I have shell open, and then I went to File, New File to open a script window. And let's save a file as, we'll just call it C3 for chapter 3, LP for loop practice, .py. And you save it in your chapter 3 folder. Okay, a for loop starts with the keyword for, and then we have a variable. We used I a lot in JavaScript, but it could be anything. We could say each pass, so each time the loop is going to iterate. Then we use the keyword in, and then we use the range function, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then we're going to give that range, in this case, a number, and that will iterate up to but not including that number. Okay, so starting at 0 and up to but not including 3. So in this case, this loop will iterate 3 times. If we had it print out the value of each pass, so if we did print each pass, and we save and run in a browser, or not run in a browser, we get 0, 1, 2. The loop iterated 3 times because it printed out 3 numbers, starting at 0, 1, 2, but when it got to 3, it stopped. Okay? We could also have it print out text. Do you remember my favorite Mario joke? What kind of overalls does Mario wear? Denim, denim, denim. Denim, denim, denim. Ha ha ha. Okay, something I didn't point out, notice that we indented the code under the for loop. Any code that is part of your loop is indented. Python, we don't really have curly brackets, we don't really have semicolons. What Python works on is indentation. So make sure you have your text indented. Usually it will do it for you, but if you happen to forget, you may have errors. So for instance, if we did not have it indented, let's see what happens. Unexpected indentation block, okay? So it wouldn't even run the program without that indentation. So this number here could also be a variable. We could have a num and set it equal to 3 and then use num here. And essentially this is going to do the same thing. It prints 3 times. We could also have it print horizontally instead of vertically. So notice it printed each on a new line. When we are in this print, we can do a comma end equals and then just have an empty string in there like a space. And if we do that, it printed on the same line. Okay? So the end allows you to print horizontally instead of vertically. There are other things that we can put inside of this range. So I'm going to change this to numbers instead. So I'm going to do for I, because that's a pretty common thing. We use that in JavaScript. Counter variables is either being I or J. And I'm going to put a 10 here. And let's just see what this looks like. We should know, how high is it going to count to? Did you get it right? Remember, it does not include that. So if you wanted it to count all the way up to 10, you've got to make some other changes. There are other values that we can include in our range function. So we have this value, which is basically how many times we want our loop to iterate. We can also tell it where we want it to start iterating. So in this case, if we run this program, it starts at 0 and iterates 10 times, not including the 10. So we go from 0 to 9. But what if we wanted to start at 1 and count through 10? Well, there's lots of different ways we could do it, but one of the ways is say 1, comma, and then change this to 11. Okay, so now if we save and press F5, it counts 1 through 10. It started counting at 1, and then it iterated 10 times, so it stopped before it got to 11. There's another value we can add inside this range function, and that is in what increment do we want to count. So by default, it's 1. Every time the loop iterates, it counts up by 1. But we could make it any number. We could say count up by 2. So if we save and execute, we get 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. Okay? So to wrap up where we are so far, to create a for loop, we use the keyword for. We have some variable name. It can be whatever we want to call it. It might be a variable that exists somewhere else in our program. We have the keyword in. We have a function called range. We're going to talk about that in a later video. Inside this range function, we can have 3 different arguments. If we have all 3, the first one should be what number do we want to start counting at. The next one, separated by a comma, would be how many times we want the loop to iterate. And the third one is our increment value. What value are we counting up, or for that matter, down with? You could do a -2 and count backwards. We have a colon, and then any code inside of our loop is indented. And in this case, we printed the value of I, and then this block of code here makes it print horizontally with a space between.